Oh, good. Working, right? So you've had two really good talks so far this morning, but I always feel that lunch feels better after a touch of disappointment. So now it's my turn to do my best for this. I don't think I should be talking for an hour. We might be talking for an hour if things go marvellously well. So my name's Andrew. Hello. It's great to see you all here. Slightly worrying to see four people here who were here last time I was here. So that's an enormous pleasure. I'll cover that in a second. I'm going to begin by writing on the board, because I feel, that a blank space needs filling. I'm going to write on the board one of the basic equations of time. Okay? So we start, the basic equation of time, we start, physicists stay with me here, we start with where we are at the moment, 2019. Did I get that right? That's the current date. Okay? I'm going to carry out now a very simple mathematical operation, minus 2, okay? Bearing in mind that the average duration of a student here is probably 3 years. 3 divided by 2 to the nearest 1 is 2, so 2019 minus 2, stay with me, it's not that complicated, come on, keep up. 2019 minus 2, and then I'm going to add 34. Okay, so anybody in the audience want to tell me, what is that sum? 2019 minus 2 plus 34. Imperial College of Science and Technology. 2041. Okay, brilliant. We've got 20. Is that correct? 51. No, 2051, right? Brilliant. I am mainly known for writing fiction, you know that. So. Okay, so. Hoist that up a little bit. 2051. Why did I do that? Because I turned up here 34 years ago, so that means that the younger of you here are going to look like this in 2051. So I bring you greetings from the past. Okay? I was particularly fascinated actually by Gavin's talk, because I was here in the 1980s and I sympathised a great deal with what Alan Moore had to say at the back end of the 1980s. When Gavin referred to the government legislating against homosexual people, that was something called Clause 28 of the Local Government Bill, which forbade local authorities from promoting homosexuality as a pretended relationship. This was a law. That was passed in the 1980s. And I was one of the angry lefties of the day who marched very loudly against that rule. So it's fantastic to be back. Thank you all very much for asking me, and it's lovely to see you. Something of a surprise too, because given my academic record here in the 1980s, it was always odds on that I was going to be asked to leave. Being asked to come back seemed at that time pretty improbable. When I wandered up Exhibition Road for the first time 34 years ago, to begin a degree actually in electrical engineering, I felt briefly as if anything was possible. I was the prince of the universe. I moved to prove that by getting a magnificent 22% in the end of my first term's exams, which was the lowest mark in the whole year, subject to some pride. But after that high point, things went badly downhill, so much so that I parted ways with the department at the end of the spring term. At this point, I should like to name check my then tutor as the most humorless and least socialised human being I think I've ever met. I'm unable to do that for 2 reasons. First, against all expectation, I subsequently discovered that there were worse people than him in the world. And second, and perhaps mercifully, I have forgotten his name. So set against that background, the fact that I eventually emerged from here with a mediocre degree in geology almost looks like success. Who would have predicted it? But then predicting the future is a bit of a mug's game, which is why I thought I'd talk about it for a while. We've just heard about whether science fiction can inspire revolution, can inspire change. Now I'm going to talk about, does it have actually anything to say about the future, or is it talking about something else? So, just before Christmas, I was very fortunate to be on a panel at a science fiction and fantasy and horror con called Sledgelit, which is the seasonal, the Christmas version of a Midlands Derby-based conference called Edgelit, which is regularly held 3 or 4 times a year. And it's absolutely superb. I strongly recommend it. And on this panel, we were asked to talk about whether science fiction had lost its ability to predict the future. Certainly a begged question going on there. We decided that it had never had an ability to predict the future, which perhaps won't surprise you, but we decided that it can extrapolate, it can speculate, it can guess. Sometimes it may foreshadow, and sometimes it may even turn out to be right, but it can't predict. Not that this stops us trying, of course. Last year I was asked by one of the big consultancies to do some future gazing, which goes to prove that other people could be monks as well, I suppose. They wanted to know what 10 aspects of the world, things like employment, education, medicine, transport, entertainment, and so forth, would look like in 2023. And I said, you must be mad. And they said, we're paying. And I said, that's a brilliant idea. What they got, of course, was a mixture of extrapolation, wishful thinking, and plain terror. But back to science fiction and fantasy. So at first sight, science fiction is of course quite often about the future. It may well be set in the future, even if it doesn't predict it. But over the last few months I've been reflecting about that as I worked on a novella, a thing called According to Kovac, which is nearly finished, and a trilogy, of which more later, if you're not careful. And it occurred to me that although all science fiction story might be set in the future, what it's really talking about is the present. It's talking about our present hopes and fears and desires and challenges. And we've just heard from Gavin, we've heard name-checked about science fiction of the 1950s, the Heinleins and Asimovs and Clarks and people like that. And they were describing 1950s Americana in space. It was a very white place, it was a very male place. It was, in those terms, they felt it was a sort of hopeful technocratic future. It's a national world, rational world ruled by science and reason. If you remember Donald Fagen, he said in his song IGY, just computers to make big decisions, programmed by fellows of compassion and vision. It's all very male, of course. But that was the 1950s, you know. Apart from being white and male and segregated, it was a time of antibiotics and the possibility of cheap nuclear power and economic growth. And it was, tobacco and DDT were okay. In fact, were actively good for you. You could actually smoke while you sprayed. It was brilliant. Out of interest, we're sitting in this very historical lecture theatre, and you can see there are little brass plates let into the desks in front of you. Does anybody know what those brass plates were originally for? Sorry? No, they were ashtrays. Yeah. When this lecture theatre was first built in the early 1960s, you would have seen columns of smoke rising from these places. It wasn't overheated brains, it was cigarettes. But by the 1960s, things had begun to go, in those terms, had begun to go wrong. The social change that was growing out of this very wealth creation that had gone on in the 1950s began to bite. Korea went wrong, then Vietnam went wrong, and at the end of the 1950s, a Russian satellite orbited the planet, beating the Americans to it. And as they listened to its sort of plaintive little socialistic bleeping going around the planet, the Americans in particular must have felt that their crown had slipped somewhat. And then at the start of the 1960s, science fiction became fearful. We've heard Harlan Ellison being name-checked. He wrote a story, again, I would sympathise with what Gavin said. Read Harlan Ellison. He wrote a story called I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream. How many people here have read that? loads of people, absolutely, wow. You know, it's a really powerful story, and it's not a happy story. Philip Jose Farmer wrote Riders of the Purple Wage. Anybody read that? Slightly less people. That one, almost more than the Ellison, I would say, read that. It's an amazing story, and it plays to elements of America right now. And all the cleverer because the title actually spoofed a Zane Grey Western called Riders of the Purple Sage. Okay, so how the mighty were fallen. So the point was here that the shine was coming off things. These things were the shine was coming up. The shine was coming off science itself. Okay. So this was the science that in the 1950s, it actually did cure polio, right? It cured tuberculosis. It brought radio and television. It brought X-rays and cancer treatments and radar and clothes that shrugged off dirt, okay? Science actually in those days, so it seemed, was good. And then suddenly it had given us wind scale, okay? It had given us the fire in an atomic plant at wind scale. It gave us 3 Mile Island. It was the science that had promised us that DDT and thalidomide were safe. Okay? There's an aside here. In my environmental, I spent quite a long career in environmental consultancy, and I used to investigate closed down factories to see if they might have any remnant harmful materials sculling about that could still be hazardous to people or to the environment. And one day, 28 years ago, I was prowling through an abandoned office of a woolen mill in the North Highlands of Scotland. And I opened a desk drawer, the roll-top Victorian desk. I opened the desk drawer, pulled out a bunch of papers, and found a sort of yellow leaflet. And it was the instructions for how to use something, which did sound absolutely useful and wonderful. It was a universal solution to all your insect pest problems, full of, obviously of interest to people in a factory full of wool. And it was declared completely safe for humans, and it was called DDT. The leaflet came from the 1950s, but as a child in the 1960s, I had a children's encyclopedia, which told me a lot about the wonderful chemicals, like DDT, that could be used to control mosquitoes and therefore malaria. And I still have that encyclopedia. And before I came here, I checked the quote. And it said, scientists have swallowed huge doses of these compounds to make sure that they are safe for people. Terry Pratchett and Jack Cohen used to talk about teaching being the profession of lying to children. They meant it kindly, but I'm not so sure. It's commonplace to suggest that we are in a time of distrust of experts. I'd go further and call it a crisis. And I suggest that the crisis is not new, that it began to smoulder, perhaps in the 1970s, and has caught fire, perhaps since the millennium. And that is something we should reflect on a little, I think, in this time of all times and in this place of all places, full of people driven by the thirst to know knowable things. Because things like laws of physics and so forth are either eternal or very long-lived, depending on how you define the beginning of the universe and the beginning of time, we tend to assume that empirical science itself, the investigation of them, is eternal. This systematic search for knowable things, but of course it isn't. It's probably 2,000 years old in the Middle East, the great civilizations of the Greeks and the Arabs who started investigating that kind of thing. It may be older in the Babylonians and the Sumerians who did early astronomy. In the Western world, because we're always playing catch-up, it dates from the middle 1200s. When Roger Bacon proposed the idea of systematic investigation of thought, and when Thomas Aquinas found a way of making the scientific thought, particularly of the Arabs and Greeks, acceptable and kind of safe for the Catholic Church, which was then the greatest power on the planet. And we're in a time of rejection of that, of resilement from some of those ideas. Why does it matter? You know, why does it matter what some lunatics on the internet say in the southern states of the United States? Well, it matters because of this. I'm going to guess, we all know it's going to happen. If I toss this in the air, right, so it'll go up, what's going to happen to it? It's going to go down, okay? Are we confident of that? We can carry out, so first you had an equation, now you have a scientific experiment. Okay, right. What happens if I do it again?
Exactly the same thing.
Okay, exactly the same thing. What happens if I do it again? Okay, I'm not going to chance my arm by trying to catch it. 3 in a row is really great. Don't usually manage one. And you know why that happens, right? Happens because physical law, this thing called gravity, we can calculate it. And because of that, you can extrapolate it. If I do it with a piece of chalk, it's going to work just the same. If I do it with a bottle of water, it'll get wet, but it'll work just the same. But supposing you take away the certainty of that law, supposing you take away empirical science, okay? Supposing you go back to what is now washing over us like a tide, belief. So you believe that this will fall. But supposing that belief is not in a physical law, supposing it is in the will of a God, which for nearly half of Americans, it is. What does that actually mean? It means that the only reason that falls is because God says so. Now, I don't know if anybody here has read the Bible Part 1. There is a sequel with a guy called Jesus in it, but it's not as good. In the Bible Part 1, it's quite clear that God is an arbitrary, changeable thing. You know, God got a bit stoned one day and made a burning bush talk to someone in the desert. Right? Are you really relying on God to do that? If I toss that into the air and the only thing that brings it down is the will of God, then it needn't come down. It could fly out of a window. It could explode. It could start singing a song by Frank Sinatra, or it could, you know, to quote Ursula K. Le Guin, it could turn into a flower or a fly or a eye or a flame. One of my favourite lists of words ever written. And if that doesn't work, then the structural engineering that holds this building up doesn't work, because that's based on a massive 1 kilogram exerting a force of 9.8 newtons in the Earth's gravitational field. Nothing works if that doesn't work. I think that matters, okay? Now, I think that this crisis of distrust, as I said, started in the 1970s. Going back to literature, remember books? Going back to books, how did they respond to that? I can answer it in one word: fantasy, okay? The 1970s saw a growth, or perhaps rather better, an explosion in fantasy writing, which blew science fiction into the weeds and kept it there for at least a decade, really. And even now, we have a publisher in the room who will probably confirm that science fiction is outsold between several and many to one by fantasy. And that's still the case. Lord of the Rings, Conan the Barbarian, the epics of David Gemmell, all of that marvellous stuff, the spin-off, the start of role-playing games, the Dungeons and Dragons precursors to everything we've heard about, all got going then. Even the success of the first Star Wars trilogy didn't really make a big dent in that. And my own reading in those days shifted too. I put away all the good stuff from Roger Zelazny and Harlan Ellison and started reading things like the first Chronicles of Thomas Covenant the Unbeliever by Stephen Donaldson. Say what you like, the man had stamina. Through the 1980s, the rate of change in the world began to increase. We spoke about the 1980s now. When I arrived here first, Berlin was divided by a wall between two worlds that were locked in a Cold War that seemed endless. And China was a vast, silent mystery, right? By the time I left, and admittedly I did take my time, a nuclear reactor at Chernobyl had exploded. One of the single events, more than any other perhaps, which ushered in the era which we knew by the name glasnost, openness, the beginning of the fall of the Soviet Union. The space shuttle Columbus had blown up in midair. The tanks had rattled across Tiananmen Square, and one of them had been stopped by a thin young man doing that in one of the most iconic images of my life, I think. And the Berlin Wall had fallen. Who would have predicted that? And now, well, the world is impossibly more diverse, connected, vibrant, argumentative, foolish, ignorant, clever, loving, hating place than anyone could have imagined when I was a child. The ascendancy of the old Western world, I think, is ending. And the next century, I believe, will belong to the new kids on the block. I think it will belong to the people from the East and the South. And writing, ever the mirror, I guess, will reflect and reflects this. So at the moment, from Africa, we have a vast explosion of writing. It had begun, possibly a few years ago by Lauren Bukes, but no, African fiction and African fantasy is becoming a thing. It has become a thing, and it's so powerful and so good. From China, Xi Jinliu's Three-Body Problem, obviously, and some really smart, weird short fiction by somebody called Jar Jar, which is absolutely brilliant. From Israel, the work of Lavi Tidar. Anybody read any of Lavi's work? Yeah. A Man Lies Dreaming was my absolute top best read of 2017. From the United States, we got the new talents, people like Charlie Jane Anders with All the Birds in the Sky. We have people like Curtis Chen with Waypoint Kangaroo, which gets my annual prize for the first use of the term of a marsupial in a near-Earth space opera. Very good going. And close to home, David Barnett, who's carving out a new path with this marvellous thing called Calling Major Tom. And not to forget, I've just talked about books, but let's talk about the gaming and the comics and the world building that goes with it, and the world of Warhammer and the world of, Marvel Universe. This is all fantastic. While I was listening to earlier talks and reflecting on this lot, I thought one thing: am I optimistic about the future? We heard earlier on maybe we've got 300 or 400 years. Am I optimistic about will we be okay next year? No, absolutely not. Am I optimistic that humanity will survive, that there is some point imagining that my far future fiction may have some basis in possibility? Yeah, I am. And I'm optimistic about that because of the Black Death. That probably needs some explanation. Sorry, do stay. So in the 1340s, right, the Black Death rolled across Europe, probably out of Central Asia, came down the Silk Road, okay? It killed about 60% of the population of Europe. It killed, over the space of several decades, a quarter of the world population. Okay, so just taken at face value, perhaps that doesn't look too good. But if you look at it the other way up, in a time of no medicine, no understanding of the germ theory of disease, no sanitation, in a time when many people began their journey by being malnourished or by having other physical ailments, 40% of Europe and 75% of the world population, despite being completely naive to this disease, survived. So when you look at it that way up, as a species, we're nearly as hard to kill as a cockroach. Not as individuals. As individuals, we're soft and floppy and flabby and vulnerable, but as a species, we're really strong. So it may not be good news for the planet and the other species around, but as far as I believe, we're likely to survive as a species. We will one day perhaps even get it right. But just as I did when I was here in the 1980s, we might need a couple of goes at it. And that's the only prediction you're going to get out of me. What I'm now going to do, since I'm feeling it's ages since I interacted with this board, is I'm going to draw another picture. Now, you're all entitled to have one guess at what that represents. Completely unfair question. So, some years...
Inside of the circles.
Circles inside other... Well, that's it. So the talk's over. Thank you very much. It's a place called The Spin. So some years ago, I decided I was going to try and write a new science fiction novel. I hadn't written one for a while. And I began with the idea of a woman up a tower, which I think you'll all agree was amazingly original. And worked from there by steps into a universe. And the universe was a small universe. A bijou universe is 88 planets and 22 suns in an artificial and probably impossible configuration called spin. Some of the planets are in figure-of-8 orbits and everything ought to bang into itself, but it doesn't. That's the mechanics of it, but the mechanics aren't so very important. What matters is the concentric layering of it, which evolved. So in the middle, you have a thing called the cordon. And the cordon contains everything that the spin doesn't like, kept securely in there. And it contains particularly a civilization, well, I call it a civilization, called the Fortunate Protectorate, which is this ghastly, medievalist, unpleasant empire. The next out, it's kind of the middle-class suburbs, really. It's the white Americana of the 1950s, almost, if you like. It's an industrial civilization. It's not a democracy. It's not a great place to be. It's called the hegemony. And then the outside is the marginal territory of the young socialist revolutionary society otherwise. So you've got those three layers. You've got medievalist, you've got dictatorial, and then you've got leftist democracy, and you've got... what tends to happen in this kind of situation is that difficult bits fall into the middle. Okay? You either keep them in the middle because they're the cordon, or they fall into the middle because stuff falls towards the middle, right? Because it does. It also occurred to me that if this was an artificial galaxy, an artificial cluster, then it was probably built by something, right? It was built by some kind of construction machine. We don't know who is doing the building, but we know that some things must have been there. And then I started thinking, because I also work in the construction industry, sort of, if you take a bulldozer, right? A picture of a bulldozer, big yellow thing, it's got tracks on the side, it's got a big shovel in front, another big shovel in behind. It's basically a tank with a glass lid and a spade nailed to it, right? So it occurred to me that construction machines are also destruction machines. Then it occurred to me that people leave things lying about. So what if one of the original construction machines that was capable of making a planetary cluster of 88 planets and 22 suns was still there, millions of years afterwards? What if it had either sunk into the middle or perhaps tried to hide itself, and had then been found by a nasty medievalist civilization who were a client state of a commercial dictatorship who were at war with a leftist insurgency? Okay, so I had that idea for a book, and I wrote some of it down. And then my partner said to me one day, "Are you going to the writing conference?" And I went, "Which writing conference?" And she said, "Don't be a fool, there's a writing conference on in Nottingham." "Yeah," I said, "that sounds great." Then she said, "Are you going to pitch for an agent one-to-one?" I said, "Do they do that?" She said, "Yes, don't be a fool. You submit a sample chapter and synopsis and so forth, and the organisers of the conference see if they want to put you in front of one of the agents who's going for the conference." "That sounds great," I said. So I submitted for an agent one-to-one. And to my outright surprise, I got an agent one-to-one, having not had an agent for some years because I'd been doing other things. And then to my real shock, the agent picked me up and said, "I quite like this story, can you finish it?" And then I thought, oh, bugger. So a year later, I had a finished book and the plans for 2 more. And then I went and got a publishing deal. And then suddenly here I am, and I don't know what happened to the intervening time. Most people try to tell stories about how they got to be published, so I thought I'd tell that one. But that's just the total length of it. I'm conscious that you've been sitting here for a long time, and I've talked for 37 minutes, and then it's probably time for you to have a go. So I would be really pleased to hear any questions anybody's got. Chuck them out there. Politics is allowed, thank you very much, and anything else is allowed too. Yes, go.
Is there a place in your worldview for both faith and science, or must they always be at odds?
In my personal worldview, I don't have a faith, I'll say that straight up. There are examples of people who've had a faith and a science. They seem to have made it work. I don't know how far that can go. Is there a point somewhere? Is there a kind of faith climb that you fall over and it makes your science not work anymore? I suspect that might be the case. But lots of people I've known of science have been people of faith, I guess. So I'm not against it, you know. Well, I am kind of, but you know. Yes.
You were talking about the Black Death and the die-off. I would agree with you that humanity isn't going to go down the tubes at that point.
Yeah.
But I would say that the high-tech society and the capacity to reboot it is going to go.
Yes, that could well be right. I think. I think if you draw the line of humanity and high-tech societies, where that is increasing tech and sort of general civilization and comfortness, and this is time. I rather suspect it's going to look like that. You know? I think but this might be major dieback, it might be mass extinction, and the science that recovers afterwards might not look like the science we had before. Sorry.
I would kind of agree with you there, because I can remember reading about the difference in technology in terms of civil infrastructure, say Roman Empire, City of Million, water supply, sewerage and everything else. Look at London, 1500, no real water supply, no sewerage, a hell of a lot of death from preventable causes. The Chinese city-states and the solution there's a lot of stuff, but in terms of being able to extract fossil fuels and the deep base supplies of rare earth minerals and everything else, the stuff you need to build electronics above the level of, say, valves, because that you could manage with Victorian, even Elizabethan almost technology. But to make chips, transistors, to create widespread electrical energy, to do the mineral refining and everything else, to ship around the parts you need to make the concrete, do all of the else, I don't think that would recover.
You may be right. You're asking me to predict the future again now. You may be right. I think it would depend on what scale humanity recovered, wouldn't it? I mean, if you recovered to the scale from being the, whatever we are now, 7.5, 8 billion people, if you recovered from that to being a few million people, then perhaps in all the science that you would require to support those few million people could be supporting on a recycling and recovery basis. You can imagine people mining landfill sites and mining minerals out of the ocean. The only thing I am actually old enough to have been around in electronics when valves were still genuinely a thing, and actually the metal chemistry that goes into making valves could not be Victorian. It would actually have to be at least 1920s, because they had some quite complicated metal coatings to make the things actually work properly on the electrodes. But yeah, apart from that. Yeah.
So I stand corrected, that's my ignorance.
Oh yeah.
Hello, the spin sounds great. I just bought a copy of the creation machine sitting here, so I'm told.
Did you know it's increased my readership by 25%?
Did you say 8 suns and 22 planets?
I'm sorry?
Did you say 8 suns and 22 planets?
No, I said 22 suns and 88 planets.
I'm sorry, okay. Well, the same question. Did you pick that number,
No.
stick with it, or did you, okay, so how did you get to the numbers?
Well, I wanted, you're asking me to disclose a plan to an extent. You didn't know that, but you I wanted to make something which had sufficient diversity in it that we could have different layers of civilization. I wanted to make something which had planets, even though they're artificial, that were at different times in their life cycles. So the tower on which our heroine is found at the beginning is on a moon which is nearly dead. I quite like things that are very old and nearly dead. I write about them rather a lot. Whereas, you know, you've got re-engineered planets near the middle, which are relatively early in their artificial regenerated life cycle. I wanted to have enough room to have clusters of 4 or 5 or 6 planets, because I think that makes for an interesting kind of solar system, and it gives you the opportunity to have your own little empire. I mean, 4 or 5 planets is quite a nice little back garden empire. So 80, you know, somewhere in the 80s felt right. I wasn't any more precise about it than that. I'd be lying if I said I was. I wasn't hired for my ability to count. You may have seen that at the beginning of the lecture. So, thank you. Yeah, sure.
Can you talk a little bit about when you were environment consultants? It says.
Oh, yeah.
In your bio.
Very brief, yes. So I started electrical engineering, made an absolute pills of it, became a geologist because, well, for 2 reasons. First, you don't have to count. I refer you to the answer I just gave before. You don't have to count very fast. You don't have to do anything very fast because rocks tend to move quite slowly. So I became a geologist, and then at the end of the 1980s I graduated just in geology. In those days there were 2 things you can do in geology. One was go and mine diamonds in South Africa. I wasn't going to do that. And the other was go and work in the North Sea, and I was determined not to do that. 9 months later, I ran out of money and went and worked in the North Sea. But before that, I'd had an interview for one of the early environmental consultancies in Edinburgh, earth science-based environmental consultancy. And I hated the North Sea to bits and was incredibly happy when I got a phone call from these people in Edinburgh saying, "Will you come and be a geologist for our environmental consultancy?" So I took a 78% pay cut and went down to Edinburgh and never regretted it. And I started doing investigations on contaminated land, you know, holes in the ground, old gasworks, coal tars, arsenic, all of the good, you know, biblical contaminants that the world was full of. And then I very gradually came up out of the ground and moved sideways into the built environment and started looking at the energy and environmental performance of buildings. And then I very gradually moved into another industry. For a little while I worked in the motor industry on the environmental side. I like lots of choices, all right. So just, and then I moved back into construction and environment, which is where I still am. And I remember, if you're a geologist and you're trying to determine the grain size of a piece of soft rock or soil, you get it between your teeth and you feel for the sand and silt grains. You don't do that on contaminated sites. But I remember the first time I dug a hole in the ground and some near-surface groundwater flowed into the hole and it had a layer of oil on it. I was viscerally upset. You know, I thought, this is awful. And this was the legacy of the Industrial Revolution going all the way through to the 60s and 70s. So that stayed with me. It became one of the things I got angry about, I think, when I was a kid. And I sort of have stayed angry about it. So there was that. Who was... loads. Charlie, we'll go left to right.
So, a bit of a left field question with respect to developing the craft of writing. How did you go about it? Did you attend writing workshops?
Yeah.
Or did you just suffer a massive rejection?
Rejection is daily. I was trying to write. About 20 years ago I was trying to write and doing, as I thought, quite well. And then my then wife said to me, "Why don't you go and do a writing course?" And I went on a 6-week writing course at the local FE college. And it was great. It was taught by a guy called George Ballantyne, who's still a friend, a wonderful guy. And then I wanted to go on the next course that George taught because I'd enjoyed it so much, took so much away from it. George wasn't teaching it. This next course was being taught by somebody called Liz Ringrose. And Liz was also great. And Liz was a member of a thing called the Leicester Writers Club, living Leicester. And Liz said to me, "Why don't you come along to the club?" Because at that time, the club was for anybody who'd been commercially published. or done certain writing courses, and I had actually sold magazine articles by then. So I went along to the club, and it was it is still a weekly manuscript night, 2 hours long, where people read out work in progress and get criticism and advice from, gifted amateurs, but also the published authors who are pretty good. I mean, one of the members of the Leicester Writers Club is a writer called Rod Duncan, who's written the Fall of the Gaslit Empire series. Chris DeLacy, who's written lots of young adult books about dragons. Masuda Snaith, who wrote a really great breakout novel called the Things We Thought We Knew. All members of the Leicester Writers Club. So what a fantastic crucible. So yeah, and I attended that club for several years regularly and still go when I can. And I still get that feeling when I stand up and I'm about to read out work in progress, thinking, have I edited this quite as well as I should have done? Because I know that there are people in there who will pick it up. So that was my route, and if anybody can do that, I really recommend it. Moving that way, yes?
You just told us a bit about your experience of reclamation sites, of contaminated sites.
Yes.
Do you think that the European experience of clearing up after the Industrial Revolution is a good precursor to clearing up our current messes, or do you think, does it give you hope that we can clear up our current messes, or do you think that we didn't do a very good job of that and that
We've been quite good at clearing up some of them. We've been good at clearing up contaminated land, but contaminated land on the whole is not that hard to clear up. And we've got quite good at it in this country, and across Europe people have got quite good. And I would name check actually this country's industry, because we made a mess first, right? We made the big coal mess first in the Industrial Revolution. And we ended up beginning to clean it up first. So some of the class-leading environmental legislation that is now in Europe sort of originated here actually in the early 70s, just because we kind of had to. We were quite good and quite early at the Clean Air Acts. When we realised that people were dying in their thousands from coal smoke in the great cities, we enacted the Clean Air Act. So we kind of did that right. Globally, we've been not bad at the response to the ozone thing, the chlorofluorocarbon destruction of the ozone layer. Not bad. I give us kind of 6 out of 10. There has been global action. It's having an effect. It's helping. We haven't got everything sorted out yet. Carbon emissions, 1 out of 10, really, as a planet at the moment. And I don't have any hope that we're going to do enough about that soon enough to avoid very substantial disruption at least, and perhaps major ecological catastrophe, I'm afraid. I think the world's got about 10 years left to change my mind on that. And at the moment, quite a lot of it is just heading in the wrong direction. So, don't know, 1 out of 2.
Thank you.
Cosmic.
It's the first time somebody's called me that in this lecture theatre for donkey's years. Hi, Andy. I'm going to be cheeky and ask effectively 2 questions. One is a question of inspiration, and in terms of the career track that you took, and that we grew up around the same time,
Yeah.
I wonder if the name Doomwatch echoes.
Yeah.
The cheeky second question is going to be, in your ecological cleanup, environmental cleanup work, have you ever cleaned up a university? Because we have a pile of really weird stuff. Maybe some good stories.
Well, I see the two short answers are yes and yes. Yeah, Doomwatch resonates very much. Doomwatch. Anybody here seen Doomwatch? I mean, it's around. Yeah. Okay. I think you can probably find it on YouTube.
You can find some episodes. I know this because I've sat on top of mountains with a telescope, being very bored, looking at what's on YouTube.
You had a telescope and you were looking at the stars and you looked at YouTube.
The way astronomy works is you point the telescope at something and let it collect photons before you read anything out.
Okay, so you get more photons out of YouTube, basically. No, I'm sorry. I'm being facetious. I recommend looking at Doomwatch, which is basically approximately what it says on the tin, and it's still, I mean, it's our generation now, but it's powerful stuff. I recommend watching it. Yeah, I've cleaned up a university. You dirty lot, honestly. Industry got regulated much earlier than universities because universities only had small quantities of very complicated chemicals in blue tins and threw them out of the back door. So yes, I have cleaned up universities. The most interesting thing can I say this? I've got time. The most interesting thing I ever did was clean up part of Glasgow, right? Fairly large part of Glasgow. I want you to cast your mind back to the open and happy time of about 1900, when the City of Glasgow Council, which has quite often been a very progressive body, was then, and it decided it would have municipal refuse collection carried out by electric dust carts, which is not bad going for 1900. And in order to power the electric dust carts, they burned the waste that they collected, generated steam, generated electricity, and charged up the dust carts, which actually is great. It's just a nice closed loop, isn't it? Slight technical hitch that the waste fairly quickly was changing in those days. In the end of the 19th century, waste was paper and cardboard and an awful lot of coal ash and a certain amount of timber and then kitchen waste and things like that. In the early part of the 20th century, it started getting more complicated organic stuff in it, like bits of Bakelite and all, all that kind of nonsense, and paint with complicated chemicals. So, wind forward to the 1990s, City of Glasgow Council wanted to know what had fallen out of the smoke plume from this incinerator, and I was able to map quite a lovely dropout plume of dioxins and furans in people's back gardens and cleaned it up, and also the site itself was a mess, but it was a well-intentioned mess. That was my biggest piece of fun, I think. We probably have time for one more, and then you've got to have some lunch. Yes?
A bit of a devil's advocate question. The example you were giving of like throwing an item up in the air and it comes down based on
Still works,
the laws.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
But does it work because you know how it works, or does it just work?
Does
that matter for that example, or for what's already in place, or does it only matter when you want to create something new? Like the building won't fall down if people stop believing in structural dynamics and gravity and all these kind of functions.
Well, you say that, but you might just have doomed all of these people, frankly.
Then I'd say that's more of a resistance argument because then it's the only thing holding it up is faith.
Fair enough. The answer is that if faith happened instead of maths, let's say, or faith happened instead of physical laws, then most of the churches stood up, okay, except the ones where the Masons got it wrong. But the reasons the Masons got it right was because it looked like what they'd got right before. You could probably design the structural framework of this building based on what that building looked like, and it would probably stay up. It wouldn't be as efficient, it wouldn't be as light, it wouldn't be as well conceived, it wouldn't be a progression. But if you wanted to design a building using a different structural paradigm because you wanted to make it taller, then you would need that to reliably fall according to physical laws. So in other words, you doom us to staying put. You know, if it's faith, then we get as far as we've got, and that's it, baby. If you want to get further, make a new bridge, a new kind of structure, a great big circular thing under the ground in Switzerland which bashes atoms into each other, then you need the physical laws to work.
And faith that they work.
It's just being difficult, really. My apologies. I think you have sat through enough, and you have been so kind. Thank you very much indeed.